The global offensive of Russian troops will begin in late November. NATO Secretary General does not want a ceasefire in Ukraine. Kyiv is fighting Moscow using combat insects. Find out more about this and other absurd claims of the Kremlin propagandists in this episode. Detector Media did all the dirty fact-checking work for you. We have separated real facts from those of a parallel universe. My name is Vadym Miskyi. In the next 10 minutes, I will tell you about the most impressive examples of Kremlin propaganda, as well as about some international media that use unverified sources of information. Here we go. A major offensive of Russian troops will begin in late November. These manipulative messages are spread by Kremlin propagandists in the media. They claim that Russia just has to train the reserves. This way, Russian propaganda tries to intimidate Ukrainians and hide its own failures in the battlefield, its humiliating retreats, and the fact that a Russian victory in this war is impossible. To prove it, Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu announced the withdrawal of Russian troops from Kherson. It was the only regional capital taken by the Kremlin since the beginning of the war.
Для нас жизнь и здоровье российских военнослужащих всегда является приоритетом. Мы должны принимать во внимание и угрозу для гражданского населения. Убедитесь, что все желающие из числа гражданского населения смогли выехать. Приступайте к отводу войск и примите все меры, чтобы обеспечить безопасную переброску личного состава, вооружения и техники за реку Днепр.
Russian propagandists were ready for the escape from Kherson. They received detailed instructions on how to present the failure of the invaders as a heroic gesture of goodwill. They were given special manuals to justify the retreat. This was reported by the Russian opposition media Meduza. Here are the key points. The Kherson direction was the most difficult at the current stage of the special operation for the Russian army, and Ukraine allegedly needs to demonstrate its combat potential to the West, to ask for weapons. At the same time, the Kremlin wants to convince that Ukraine and NATO countries have shown all their forces in the Kherson region. Also, propagandists are asked to pay attention to the speech of Anatoly Torkunov, historian and political scientist, member of the Scientific Council under the Security Council of Russian Federation. At the meeting with Putin, he mentioned the Battle of Poltava. He noted that to win it, Peter I retreated to Poltava. It was the retreat that eventually led to a turning point in the war. Propagandists have fulfilled this instruction to the letter. They do not mention the retreat of the Russian army, but delicately call this step a redeployment to the left bank of the Dnieper River. Take a look at this narrative.
Тут просто надо исходить из военной целесообразности, рационально принимать решения. Абсолютно никому не нужны эти напрасные, так сказать, жертвы, да? Это очень тяжелое решение. И чтобы такое решение принять, надо быть очень мужественным человеком.
Важное умение. Оно сейчас нам всем очень нужно, на мой взгляд. Это умение вовремя завалить хлебало своих эмоций.
Желательно до победного конца. Вопрос стал, что называется, ребром. Кто кого. Сразу скажу, времена непростые. Все понимают. Времена тяжелые. Из-за Херсона переживаем. Решение принято, решение сложное. Нам сказали, что оно связано с желанием сберечь российскую армию.
While Kremlin propagandists are dreaming of a counteroffensive and a quick return of Russians to Kherson, locals are welcoming Ukrainian soldiers like this, right across the entire city. Moscow's statement on the retreat from Kherson was expected and shows the problems in the armed forces of the Russian Federation. This statement was made by the President of the United States, Joe Biden, after hearing about this news.
No, I'm not. That's up to the Ukrainians. Nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine.
So what kind of compromise do you have in mind?
I didn't have any in mind. You have asked the question whether or not, if I recall, whether or not what would happen if, in fact, after I think the context is that whether or not they're pulling back from Fallujah and from the Kherson, the city of Kherson, and they're coming back across the river to the eastern side of the river, the Russian forces. And I said, what's going to happen is they're going to all both lick their wounds, decide what they're going to do over the winter, and decide whether or not they're going to compromise. That's what's going to happen, whether or not. I don't know what they're going to do. But I do know one thing, we're not going to tell them what they have to do.
In the first days after the Russian retreat from Kherson, NATO Secretary General stated that Russia is facing pressure.
At the same time, the unprecedented support that NATO allies, including Italy, has provided is making a difference on the battlefield every day and remains vital for the Ukrainian progress. We have taken note of the Russian announcement to retreat from Kherson. We have to see how the situation on the ground develops in the coming days. But what is clear is that Russia is under heavy pressure. And if they leave Kherson, it would be another victory for Ukraine.
The retreat from Kherson is a defeat for the Kremlin, but not the end of the war, according to U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan.
So first, this is a significant military milestone for the Ukrainians if in fact it happens that Russia follows through and withdraws to the far side of the Dnieper River. Of course, we're going to watch actions and not just announcements to see what actually unfolds. But if this does come to pass, that will mean in the Battle of Kyiv, in the Battle of Kherson, in the Battle of Kharkiv, the Ukrainians will have prevailed against an invading, marauding force that conducted an illegal war in their country. But of course, it's not the end of the war, because Russia continues to occupy parts of Ukrainian territory. We are continuing to support the Ukrainians in their effort to defend their sovereignty and territorial integrity.
The retreat of Russian troops from Kherson is a huge failure for the Kremlin. This is the opinion of analysts of the Washington Post. The New York Times wrote that the order to withdraw Russian troops from the strategically important southern city of Kherson could deal a serious blow to Putin's military efforts. The newspaper calls the move an embarrassing defeat for Russia. Not a single reputable Western outlet wrote anything about the fantasies of the Kremlin propagandists about a possible major Russian offensive at the end of November. NATO Secretary General does not want to ceasefire in Ukraine. This information is spread by Russian propaganda media. In their reports, they claim to quote Jens Stoltenberg. However, this is not true. In fact, NATO cannot cease fire because the alliance troops are not fighting in Ukraine. According to Stop Fake fact-checkers, propagandists used fragments from the Stoltenberg's speech at the UN Climate Change Conference to produce this fake. However, Stoltenberg said that it is necessary to end the war and described the easiest way for Putin to take this step.
So we need to support Ukraine to strengthen their hand in what most likely at some stage will become negotiations to end the war. The last thing I will say is that we have to remember what this is. This is a war of aggression. One country, Russia, attacking another country. So if President Putin and Russia stops to fight, then we will have peace. If President Zelensky and Ukraine stops to fight, then Ukraine will cease to exist as an independent nation. So this is the difference between an aggressor and the victim of aggression. We support Ukraine in the right for self-defense, a right actually enshrined in the UN Charter. So President Putin must stop the war. That will be good for Ukraine, it will be good for our security, and it will be good for global food and energy prices, and that makes it just even more important for him to stop the war.
Kremlin propagandists applied the same principle to the following fake. Allegedly, the US military is already fighting in Ukraine. In fact, US military personnel are checking the delivery and distribution of weapons in Ukraine. Pentagon Press Secretary Pat Ryder provided details on the presence of US military personnel in Ukraine.
As mentioned, we do have small teams that are comprised of embassy personnel that are conducting some inspections of security assistance delivery at a variety of locations. And again, this is part of a broader effort of the U.S. government to track U.S.-provided capabilities and to prevent the illicit spread throughout Eastern Europe. Again, I will highlight up front, we have no indication that there has been any type of illicit spread. The capabilities that we provided to the Ukrainians are being used effectively on the battlefield. In terms of personnel that are conducting these inspections, my understanding is they would be well far away from any type of frontline actions. We are relying on the Ukrainians to do that. We're relying on other partners.
The White House stressed that the United States will continue to provide military support to Ukraine.
Right now, what the Ukrainians are focused on is defending their critical infrastructure against these barbaric attacks that are killing civilians and harming, the basic functioning of the economy, and trying to take their territory back. The United States is not pressuring Ukraine. We're not insisting on things with Ukraine. What we are doing is consulting as partners and showing our support not just through public statements or moral support, but through the tangible physical support of the kind of military assistance I mentioned before.
Russia needs such fakes to fit the narrative that it is not really at war with Ukraine, but with NATO countries. The United Kingdom plans to reduce its assistance to Ukraine. This fake has been spread in Russian propaganda media. The reports claim that British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak supposedly plans to decrease aid to refugees. The propagandists quote the British edition of the Daily Mail, which is claimed to have written that the Prime Minister plans to cut spending because of Britain's budget deficit. This is a fake. According to experts of the Center for Countering Disinformation under the Ukrainian Security and Defense Council, assistance to Ukraine from the UK continues. Among other things, the sponsorship scheme Homes for Ukrainians is currently in operation. If the number of refugees increases, the country may introduce changes to the program, but they are not going to stop it. In a telephone conversation with President Volodymyr Zelensky, Rishi Sunak promised to continue to support Ukraine. Volodymyr Zelensky invited Rishi Sunak to visit Kyiv. Combat insects are at the ready. Ukraine has drones capable of spraying containers with insects. This fake was spread by the Kremlin propagandists. Russia appealed to the UN to carry out an international investigation into Ukraine's supposed participation in the use of biological weapons.
В соответствии с описанием, такой беспилотник транспортирует в заданный район контейнер с большим количеством комаров, переносчиков инфекции, и высвобождает их. При укусе комары инфицируют атакуемых людей возбудителями особо опасных заболеваний. В пояснении прямо подчеркивается, что зараженный военнослужащий, в случае чего, цитирую, заболевание может быть более ценным военным инструментом, чем самые современные вооружения и военная техника.
Russia is trying to force its upset conspiracy theories on the UN. That's how the US permanent representative to the UN reacted to Russia's statement.
Russia has called us here once again for the sole purpose of spreading disinformation. We all know these claims are pure fabrications brought forth without a shred of evidence. And I would even venture to say the Russian delegation knows these charges are fabricated, but they dutifully carry out marching orders from President Putin. All Russia has are bizarre conspiracies that are no more credible today than when they first brought it to this council 6 months ago. So while I believe this meeting is a colossal waste of time, and we should decide just how much of our time we allow Russia to waste, I'm glad this council has the chance to see Russia's disinformation campaign for what it is. an attempt to distract from the atrocities Russian forces are carrying out in Ukraine, and a desperate tactic to justify an unjustifiable war.
Permanent representative of the United Kingdom to the UN stated that Russia deliberately clutters the agenda of the UN Security Council with nonsense.
Russian Federation has repeatedly spread disinformation, including wild claims involving dirty bombs, chemical weapons, and offensive biological research. How much more of this nonsense do we have to endure?
Only Russia and China voted for the resolution. The UN Security Council did not support Russia's resolution to search for biological weapons in Ukraine. According to experts of EU versus Disinfo project, Ukraine has signed the binding UN Convention of the Prohibition of the Development, Production and Stockpiling of Biological Weapons and strictly follows its provisions. The only thing Nebenzia achieved with his spectacular speech about combat insects in the UN Security Council is that he became the subject of numerous memes. Humor will help Ukraine defeat its enemy. Stay tuned. Have a good day.